We all know the story of the Titanic, right? Giant ship, iceberg, a tragic accident. But what if that's not the whole story? For more than a century, there's been this darker, spookier legend whispered around that the unsinkable ship wasn't taken down by ice, but by a 3,000-year-old Egyptian curse. Think about it. Over 1,500 people died that night in the freezing Atlantic. The scale of it was it was completely unimaginable. And when something that terrible happens, people need a reason. They need an explanation that makes sense of the senseless. So which was it? Was it just a terrible accident? A failure of technology? Or was the Titanic actually doomed before it ever left the dock, targeted by some ancient, vengeful power? Okay, so to get to the bottom of this legend, we've got to meet the main character, or the main object, I guess. It's at the absolute heart of the story, and it's known as the unlucky mummy. But here's the first twist, and this is pretty important. It's not actually a mummy. Not the wrapped-up body kind. What we're talking about is the mummy board, basically the painted inner coffin lid. It would have rested right on top of the priestess's body. So it's her face just staring out at us 3,000 years later. And get this, way before the Titanic was even built, this thing had already earned a seriously terrifying reputation. Let's trace the trail of pure chaos it supposedly left behind. So, the story goes, right? The first English folks who owned it back in the 1880s, bam, instant misfortune. We're talking accidents, going broke. The next person who owned it said her entire house was plagued with sickness and death until she just had to get rid of it. And even when it ended up in the British Museum, workers there started reporting creepy stuff, like hearing weeping sounds and having bizarre accidents. Okay, but maybe the most chilling part of the legend is this one. A photographer was hired to take a picture of the board, but when he developed the photo, he saw a second, ghostly face staring back at him from the print. The story says he killed himself not long after that. I mean, how terrifying is that? And this is where a really important person enters the story. A man who didn't just write about the curse, he would become its most famous victim. Meet William Thomas Stead. This guy was basically a rock star journalist of his time, super famous, and he was a serious investigative reporter. But he was also a dedicated spiritualist. He really believed in the supernatural. So for him, the idea of a cursed Egyptian artifact wasn't some silly story. It was totally possible, and he decided to investigate it all himself. Now, Stead wasn't just repeating spooky stories he heard. No, he claimed he could actually feel the curse coming off the object. He wrote that it radiated, and this is a direct quote, a profound malevolence. He genuinely felt like something evil was looking at him from behind those painted eyes. All right, you have to hear this. This is the insane twist that pretty much cemented the whole legend. 20 years before the Titanic even existed, Stead wrote a fictional story. And what was it about? A huge ocean liner hitting an iceberg in the Atlantic and sinking, killing tons of people. Fast forward to 1912, he gets on the real-life Titanic and dies when it sinks. He literally became a victim in the exact kind of disaster he had written about 2 decades earlier. You can't make this stuff up. So it's an incredible story, right? The journalist who investigates the curse ends up being its biggest victim. It's almost too perfect. But with a story this wild, you have to step back and ask, what does the actual evidence say? Was this mummy board ever even on the Titanic? This really is the million-dollar question. I mean, for the curse to be real, the artifact had to be on the ship. So let's take a look at the official records. And this is where the whole spooky story hits a brick wall of reality. The legend says the board was sold to an American collector and loaded onto the Titanic. But the British Museum's records, they're crystal clear. It never left the museum. Ever. It's not on the ship's cargo list. In fact, on the exact night the Titanic went down, the so-called unlucky mummy was safe and sound in its display case back in London. The museum has been saying the same thing for over a century now. Artifact EE2254-2, the unlucky mummy, was never sold, never loaned, and was absolutely nowhere near the Titanic. So, from a factual point of view, that's kind of the end of the story. But hold on. If the story is just not true, then that brings up the real mystery here. Why are we still talking about it more than 100 years later? Why won't this legend just die? Well, the answer, it turns out, has less to do with ancient Egypt and way more to do with us. You see, the legend popped up in this perfect storm of obsession. At the time, society was crazy for all things Egypt. They called it Egyptomania. Tombs were being discovered, artifacts were being shipped to London, and all these stories about ancient curses came with them. Plus, this was a time when spiritualism was huge. People were trying to contact the dead all the time. So the idea of a cursed object wasn't just a fun, scary story. It felt totally believable. It gives a supernatural reason for a very human tragedy. And honestly, our brains are just wired to look for patterns. We'd often rather believe in a big, dramatic story than a simple, horrifying truth. Think about it. The real reason the Titanic sank, mechanical problems, mistakes by the crew, just plain bad luck, it all feels so small. It feels so ordinary compared to the massive scale of the disaster. A 3,000-year-old curse from an Egyptian priestess? Now that felt like an explanation big enough and epic enough to fit the tragedy. So, in the end, the legend of the unlucky mummy doesn't really teach us much about ancient curses, but it teaches us a ton about ourselves. And it leaves us with one last big question to think about. When you're faced with something truly unimaginable, what kind of stories do you tell yourself to make it all make sense?